Well, good morning, everyone. Well, I guess we should thank Keith for giving us a whole new thing to worry about. It got the heart pumping a little bit, and to Nina and Joanna, which reminds us on why we need solicitors. I feel a little bit lightweight now following all of that. Look, today is 4th of July, by the way. I'm an American, and so it's really quite auspicious, American Revolution and all the rest of it. And when I agreed to do this talk, I think it was sometime around the inauguration, I was really anticipating giving a talk about Trump and what he managed to, what's the right words to use? Well, just probably trying to mop up after whatever Trump catastrophes had unfolded. It hasn't happened. Right? As a matter of fact, the IMF have downgraded GDP in the United States from about 2.6% this year to about 2.2% on the fact that it doesn't look like Trump's going to be able to push through any significant fiscal stimulus this year. Tax reform looks to be a bit shaky, although they're adamant it's going to go ahead. Infrastructure doesn't seem to be seeing any particular investment at the moment, and Obamacare repeal seems to be stuck in the Senate. What I'd say to you is that it looks like the U.S. system of checks and balances has, in fact, sort of brought the whole procedure to a slow unfolding of events rather than some rapid change that a lot of people were expecting. So I take a little bit of, I'm a little bit more relaxed about the whole thing in that context. What I want to focus on today is the UK, and I think you surmised from the title that even though we've had really substantial political change over the course of the last year, that argument I want to make today is that so far economics hasn't really changed very much. Excuse me. So what I've got here is a chart to start things off, which shows that, where is it? There it is, sorry. You can look at either side. On the right-hand side is the contribution of various parts of the economy to GDP, and on the left-hand side is the contributions to growth in the GDP, and you can see that it gives us the same message that household spending is pretty much the main game in town here, and that if you look to the left in the light pink, that's pre-EU referendum, and in the dark red is pretty much now. So you can see that this hasn't really changed much at all. I would argue that there's all sorts of reasons why that hasn't changed, but when I think back to the big Lehman's collapse and the Great Recession, I remember we had the head of valuation in our department, Russell Francis, who some of you may know, who said, Walter, he said, the thing about the UK economy, like all large economies, is it's a bit like a super tanker. You know, you can get tugboats and you can try to push it around, but it doesn't really move until it's ready to move. Furthermore, I think we also know there's a big theme about technology that's running through things at the moment. And from what I can see in terms of this focus on consumer spending and household spending, it looks like all the technological developments that we have occurring at the moment seem to be entrenching the existing pattern. So in fact, it doesn't seem like the economy is going to move much, even though there's a lot of moves at way to try to push it around and start to rebalance it to certainly away from London, but also into other new sectors. So consequently, this real focus on household spending is pretty much the key worry. Now I'm showing you here some retail data. So it'd be on the left-hand side, looks at growth in retail sales between first 5 months of 2016 in red and the first 5 months of this year in blue. Now, I was like many people up and for about the first 4 months of the year, I was resisting the view that retail spending had come off, and don't forget this is about half of all household spending. But I decided to crunch some numbers in preparation for this conference, actually, as it happens, and I suddenly discovered that in the first 5 months of this year, as compared to last year, retail sales has fallen from 4.2% growth last year down to pretty much flat at 0.2%. What I found really quite shocking is that in the first 5 months of 2016, internet sales were up 13.5%, whereas this year they're up a very modest 2.3%, which I found really quite startling. Why is the question? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with Brexit-related things, weak sterling, imported inflation in particular. This has had a direct impact on retail sales because prices have gone up, of course. If you look over on the right-hand side, you can see real wages. So in the little dotted line, that's CPI inflation. And sure enough, as inflation goes up, real wages go down, and it's falling quite precipitously. In April, it was falling at a rate of about 2% year on year. Obviously, this is given a real hit to retail confidence. And also, I think this is one of the reasons that we're hearing all these noises about pay caps and the end of austerity and all the rest of it, because the squeeze seems to be back on again. Now, there is another thing that's kept retail spending and household spending going in the UK for some considerable period. It's not unique to the UK, but it's definitely important in the UK. And that is the wealth effect that comes from rising house prices. But here too, and I've listed several of the reforms that have happened over the last couple of years, tightening up on the non-dom status, stamp duty reform, loss of BTL, interest rate relief, and things of this sort. The government has taken quite a lot of active policies to cool the rate of house growth. It was in double digits. Arguably, it was unsustainable. And they've pushed down the rate of house price growth into single digits. Now, okay, fine. You'll say, well, that's not a bad thing, Walter. There's a lot of people that are trying to get on the housing ladder and all the rest of it, and I would tend to agree with that. But with falling real wages and no house price growth, where is the alternative for this government to stimulate growth in the short term? Well, you could argue that we could push for a little bit more of the same. Now, I'm showing you a little bit of a complicated chart here. I think the thing to really look at is the red bars, which show the divergence of pricing in individual markets across the UK from their long-term trend, not from peak pricing, that's in blue. So for instance, on the left-hand side, you can see the North, Yorkshire and Humberside, Northwest, East Midlands, West Midlands are all still below long-term trend. Now, this might suggest that there is still some scope for stoking house prices, certainly in the regions. If you look at London, of course, they're above trend now and they're pretty much well beyond where they were at the peak. I would argue that a lot of the measures that they put through so far have really been targeted at cooling London, and that has generally come through so far. The question is that how do you go about stimulating the housing market without being seen to be benefiting the haves as against the have-nots? All right, so we have the other alternative, I guess, is to tax and spend to try to stimulate the economy, or perhaps borrow and spend. Is that good? Is that bad? I guess it really depends on what you decide to spend on. I'll come back to that in a minute. The good news is that the Bank of England seem to be doing their part. The hawks, you're starting to hear hawkish noises coming out of there. We need to raise rates a bit sooner. We need to tighten monetary policy in anticipation of whatever's to come. I think that we need to look through the chat that we have at the moment. Mark Carney spoke at the Mansion House about a week or so ago, and his emphasis was on financial stability, and it always has been. And I think until we have a clear picture of what the exit's going to look like as far as the EU goes, I think probably he's going to remain on the dovish side of the spectrum. So I think you'll look through inflation as the other part of the story. If you look at these colorful curves I have there, Britain's in green, these are forward instantaneous rates, which are meant to be a surrogate for where base rates are going to be in a few years' time. And you can see out at the end, 5 years' time, it would suggest that base rates are still at 1%. So I would argue that the interest rate environment, despite some of the noises that's coming out of the bank, some of the hawkish noises, is still reasonably benign. And so consequently, I think we can conclude that at least, even though if we don't know what the fiscal stimulus might look like, at least the monetary policy remains accommodative and will enable the fiscal stimulus, whatever sort of shape it may take. Well, what about these policies, these fiscal policies? What can be pursued to stimulate growth in the economy without stoking the house prices, as it were? Well, I don't think we're going to really find out, and certainly the way things are shaking up in the cabinet, where it's hard to know who's in the ascendancy, who's on the way out, and all the rest. I would suggest to you, though, that the Tory conference is going to happen on the first week of October, and I think we'll start to get a little bit more clarity in terms of political leadership, certainly. Then, of course, there's the autumn budget in the end of November, and by that time we'll have a pretty clear view on what's happening with the economies, particularly from the household spending point of view. And then I think probably Hammond will have his hands full on trying to come up with the right mix of ingredients, as it were. I don't think he's going to pull a rabbit out of a hat like Osborne seemed to do, but I wouldn't put it past him. But I've put a whole list of things. He's already told us that austerity is going to be eased. Okay, fine. I thought, well, maybe commercial rates reform for property? Nah, too complicated. Housing market support, no, like I say, less likely because otherwise it benefits the haves. I'll come back to the next one. Splash cash on social care in some form. I suspect there'll be something for the NHS. It'll be something for long-term adult care. I think possibly pay caps may get revisited and all the rest. And oh, by the way, the pay cap of 1%, I looked into it, and 1% is exactly the annual rate of increase on tax revenues for the government for the last 3 or 4 years. I don't think there's an accident that they have a pay cap at 1%. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to do the mechanics of that and the mass of that, but we'll see how that goes. Then I have help for the haves, definitely not. Help for the have-nots, yes, but it probably won't help. Sorry, that wasn't a very good joke, but I think probably the one I want to focus on now, though, is that I think that there's very few short-term options that the government can seek, and so I think what we're going to look at, or what we're going to see, is a shift to the borrow to invest thing. And this was notably missing from Osborne's agenda, which I thought was, that was the only criticism I really had of Osborne, to be honest with you. With the low interest rate environment that we're in, it just seemed like an excellent time to borrow to invest in long-term things like infrastructure and all the rest of it, and I do think that that's where we may be headed. Now, I want to make this connection by just saying to you that don't forget we just had a bunch of new mayors that have been elected across the numerous local combined authorities, these new entities that have been created over the last couple of years. Now, nobody really noticed it, primarily because the way the media covered it was as an indicator of what sentiment was ahead of the general election. But this was actually of vital importance in terms of pushing forward this rebalancing of the economy to move us away perhaps from the huge reliance on house price growth and household spending and all the rest of it. And it's part of this whole regional development agenda. So what I have here is a picture of the local combined authorities that have come together with mayors leading them, and that's an important point. I'll come back to that in a moment too. Now, these things are set up to receive devolved powers, but also to receive greater funding for local investment. And also, these ones with the mayors get their own individual borrowing powers. Also, they're going to be targets of infrastructure spending, and in the last autumn statement, Hammond told us that these mayor-led local combined authorities would be the focus of government policy and further devolution. That was absolutely clear. So much so that if we put a little list together of the mayoral-led ones over there on the left-hand side, I call that the Premier League, so these are the ones that have ticked all the boxes and theoretically should be the focus of Hammond's thinking. And then you move to the right, you can see those that have not yet adopted mayors, such as West Yorkshire. They're having problems getting it together with Bradford, apparently. Then you go a little to the right, and it becomes weaker and weaker. And I think a lot of these areas were getting a bit nervous, and so in the last manifesto, Theresa May said that no, these other areas wouldn't be ignored, but I would argue that probably the real focus is going to go in on that Premier League, not merely because they have the mayoral system, but also their scale. I've stuck up some numbers. I'm not sure if you can see these too well, but the GDP of the West Midlands local authority is about 52 billion. Greater Manchester local authority is 52 billion. West of England is 40 billion. You go along all the totals there, and you get down to London, which is about 333 billion. So there's a pretty big order of magnitude difference between the two. One interesting thing in this, I think, which is something to watch if you're interested in these things, is the West Midlands is being led by Andy Street, who's the ex-CEO of John Lewis, and he's very much understands exactly the way this whole mayoral system was set up. It was a means of getting local stakeholders together to find out what they thought needed to be done, and then making representations to central government to get the support they need in order to achieve their goals, as compared to Greater Manchester, led by Andy Burnham, who's a little bit more of a top-down, ideologically driven approach, where you go in to tell the local stakeholders what you think needs doing. Now, I can tell you that, is this Chatham House Rules? Oh no, we got a journalist in the room. Never mind, we won't go into that story. Andy's learning how things work in Manchester, I can tell you. So we'll see how that goes. In a few years' time, let's see how these two GDP figures stack up. I think I know where I'd put my money. So anyway, the good news is that these devolution and the Northern Powerhouse agenda will go forward. I didn't realize it, but it had been put on the back burner by Theresa May at the advice of these two unelected advisors, Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, which was a travesty. But now it's fully back on the agenda now. A guy named Jack Berry's been pointed out as the new Northern Powerhouse Minister. they're setting up a prosperity fund now to replace the EU funding, of course, that'll be lost in due course. So I do think that the seriousness of this rebalancing of the economy, both geographically and also sector-wise, is definitely in the cards. There is some already a significant commitment to infrastructure, which is targeted at linking these regions together in order to develop the critical mass that you need and the economies of scale for business. That's moving ahead really rapidly. There's the National Infrastructure Commission's been set up, which is tasked with identifying infrastructure needs, prioritizing, and I would argue that probably if you're a mayor in one of these local combined authorities, you're going to be speaking to the NIC to say, oh, no, we need it before these other guys. I can see how that argument's going to go. I also looked at the National Infrastructure Commission, and they all come out of finance backgrounds. So I think the thinking is that they'll use what monies that the government can have to seed fund projects, and then they'll look for the heavy lifting from institutional funds, both foreign and domestic, to push the agenda forward. So there's going to be huge scope for private investors. Now, if you're clever, you're already sitting there thinking where are the real estate angles on this. So I would argue that the whole thing sits on a bed of new commercial development, pretty much UK-wide. If I was looking for focal points, I would look really no further than a lot of these local combined authorities with the mayors, particularly the ones with already have a critical mass, whether it's Greater Manchester, whether it's the West Midlands, and the like. I just think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. And this, of course, is all being driven by population change. Now, if you look over on the right-hand side, you can see in blue total population in Greater London is set to grow by something like 20% over the next 15 years. And in yellow, you can see the working force population, working age population is set to grow by a similar amount. Then it drops off really quite dramatically. East of England and the southeast are still positive. In terms of working age population, you can see that there's a serious problem, a disconnect between the southeast and the rest of the UK. And I can tell you that these local combined authorities that have formed, certainly in the northwest, are very mindful of this. And so they're working really hard to try to attract in the right sorts of businesses in order to retain the people that they have there and to develop a workforce as part of this rebalancing program. Now, as far as Brexit goes, you can see the urgency of doing all this. There's some other trends that are involved with this. I mentioned not just the political trends, but also the technological trends. And my own view is that given the weight of population and the task that we have just to support the general population, that the politics is looking less relevant, and what seems to be more relevant is the technological change. When I look at what's happening, certainly to leasing markets across the UK, over on the right-hand side, I can tell you that our fintech guys are run off their feet over in the city, trying to find space for new startups. I was looking at the banking employment figures, which are pretty flat, like for finance generally, only to discover that the IT figures were going up. And I'm thinking what's happening is that a lot of banking jobs are being redefined as IT jobs now, as it were. So when they say tech media in the city, it may not mean exactly what you're thinking. It's actually a new form of banking. You get outside of London, you get into the engineering and the life sciences, despite the medical health agency talking about moving to some other country. No, there's still a huge number of requests coming through for information on leasing throughout the UK, coming through our own life sciences team at Collier's. Professional services, I still think, remains extremely strong. I'm not completely relaxed about the whole thing. You know, as a foreigner here, I've never taken on a British passport. It does, raise a few questions of my own mind, I could tell you. But I think probably the message I want you to take from this, and I think this is something that Barry's going to say a couple of words about in a minute, is that there's a critical mass of expertise in the UK that is hard to match anywhere in the world, and I think that's likely to see us through, provided we don't do anything to chase these people off. Now, I don't want to say too much about Brexit, except to say that there's a whole scale of results that we can get here. On the far left is that we have absolutely no deal and we crash out under World Trade Organization rules, no free movement or anything. I don't think that'll happen. The EU needs the UK finance and expertise probably more than we need certain aspects of the EU, to be honest with you. You go to the other side of the spectrum, though, all the way to the right, and there we've got complete single market access, free movement of goods and services. Well, no, that's not going to happen, because one of the reasons that we theoretically had this Brexit vote was to control movement, certainly, of people, as it were. So I suspect we'll be somewhere in between. We'll probably end up with bits of a far-ranging bespoke trade deal combined with maybe customs unions for certain aspects of goods. So there'll be some in-between thing. But look, we've got another year of uncertainty before we know how this is all going to play out. So look, to conclude, just a couple of events to watch over the rest of this year. So what do I have here? Oh yeah, the end of this week, 7th of July, G20 meeting in Germany. They're already, listen, there already is violence over there. They're expecting 100,000 protesters. Look, Trump's going to be there, Erdogan's going to be there, and Putin's going to be. Listen, there's something there for everybody, you know, and the crowds across. We got the Greek debt payment due on the 8th of July, and now I'm assured that it's going to be handled, but they still have kicked the can down the road a bit. The interesting thing on the negotiations is apparently the EU has agreed that we're going to meet once a month for 1 week to push forward the divorce terms discussions, all the phase ones. And this sort of culminates after the German election and after the Conservative Party conference in Manchester in mid-October with phase one discussion conclusion, where the EU Council will meet mid-October to evaluate the discussions and to decide whether we're going to go into phase two, which is the trade deal negotiations. Look, there's a long way to go between here and there. We all got an autumn budget in there, and then finally by the end of the year we'll probably get some sort of miserable results, and we'll be depressed for Christmas. I don't know. It just seems to me like we got quite a lot of chaos to come. We don't know where this is going to play out. I feel reasonably positive because I think the UK PLC is not in a bad position economically. I think probably, if anything, maybe there's a few lost opportunities here and there. That would be it. Listen, I'm going to hand over to David. Thank you very much for your time.